Hello, I'm Regina Botros, and this is Backstage, where we talk with the who's who on stage, in dance, comedy and performing arts, speaking with the leading theatre makers of our times and how they came to the stage and what drives them and inspires them. And my guest is Anchuli Felicia King to talk to the production The Poison of Polygamy, which has opened at STC, Sydney Theatre Company. And this is a play adapted from the first novel by a Chinese-Australian author, Wang Shiping, originally published in 1910, I nearly said 2010, 1910, and it tells the story of Sleep Sick, an opportunistic young man from Guangdong who has his sights set on amassing his fortune in Australia's gold fields. And we're off from there. And Anchuli Felicia King is a playwright, screenwriter and multidisciplinary artist of Thai Australian descent. As a playwright, she's interested in linguistic hybrids, digital cultures and globalizations. And her plays have been produced by the Royal Court of London, that's White Pearl, which was also staged here at STC, as well as Washington, D.C., American Shakespeare Centre, Melbourne Theatre Company, Sydney Theatre Company, and on and on. She's worked as a screenwriter on HBO's The Baby and The Sympathizer, among others. She has won many awards, commissions and residencies and was the 2019 Patrick White Fellow for Sydney Theatre Company. Welcome, Anchuli.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So before we get into this, what sounds like an epic play, and I'm very excited to talk about it, in fact, but before we do, and it's getting 5 stars reviews if I hadn't said that already, how did you come to the theatre as a playwright or as a writer? Like, what was life like for you growing up? Was it a theatrical household, a creative household?
No, I mean, nobody in my family is in the creative industries, but I always loved making things. I think I had a twin sister growing up, and we would write musicals together. We loved the theater when we were growing up, but I was never really a writer. In fact, my sister was the writer of the family. And I started out in theater very much as a designer. I was a composer and sound designer primarily. And it wasn't until I went to study dramaturgy in New York that they forced us to take a compulsory playwriting class. And that's when I started writing plays.
So are you a musician as well? You say sound composer and designer?
Particularly sort of early on when I was at Melbourne Uni, I sound designed and composed a lot of shows. We composed musicals that we took to the Fringe. My sister would write the book and then I would write the music and lyrics. So that was really where I got my start, making sort of really massive orchestral scores or sound design for productions. And through that, I got into projection and video design. I was very much like a Jill of all trades starting out in the indie theater.
Wow, that's what a start. And it sounds like it's just given you, I guess so many tools. But so did you learn music growing up? And then what took you to New York?
Sure. I mean, so I am very much self-taught in pretty much everything that I've done. And I just learned a lot of stuff on the job, basically. I kind of always have. But honestly, so I was working at indie theater a lot in Melbourne, doing shows back to back, and started to feel a little frustrated with the theater culture here at that time. You know, it wasn't a very diverse theater scene when I was growing up. I just started to look more and more at the work that was happening in the States, particularly sort of Asian American playwrights who I admired, and felt like I could work on the kind of work politically that I wanted to work on in New York. And also there was just a lot more opportunity for somebody like me over there. So I applied to just one program, the dramaturgy program at Columbia, because it was known for being a really multidisciplinary program, where you got a really broad theater education. And I got in, and that's what took me to New York.
Wow. So what came from doing that? And was that sort of basically the training that has amalgamated all of these sort of interests together?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a pretty intense conservatory style program where, we studied dramaturgy in the sort of literary critical way. We read lots of plays and we did literary analysis. But we also, because we didn't have a design department in the school, I ended up designing a lot of my friends' shows. I ended up acting in things, we churned out a lot of work. And I think it really has trained me as like a theater artist. And also a lot of my closest collaborators still came out of that program.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you spend over there, and what was that kind of Asian American playwright or theatre scene like compared to here?
It's a really amazingly vibrant theater scene, and a big part of that is there's so many different levels of theater going on in New York, all the way from like off-Broadway to Broadway, and it is a really diverse theater scene. And a lot of the playwrights who I still consider like my mentors, like David Henry Hwang taught me at Columbia. There are playwrights there like Rajiv Joseph, Young Jean Lee, Asian American playwrights who I really look up to and admire were my teachers and my colleagues. So that was a really formative time for me, and I spent pretty much 4.5 years there at school and then working on my student visa after that.
Right. So what was the first thing you did, and when did you go, okay, there's this sort of all of these skills, and then the first thing you decided to write, was it like a short or what was that moment? Do you remember?
Yeah, so it really was as a result of this class that we were forced to do as dramaturgs, which was kind of like an empathy-inducing exercise for the dramaturgy students. They made us write plays. I think out of that class I wrote like a tiny little one act that wasn't very good called Orientalism, obviously. But I kind of caught the bug. I started to feel like I was reading so many plays at that time and doing so much dramaturgy that I had thought a lot about, politically what I wanted to say as a playwright, and I thought a lot about structure and form. And then that summer, I wrote my first full-length play, which was White Pearl, which kind of then exploded the following year and got programmed everywhere.
So doing that, was there kind of a gap or something that you saw necessarily, or was it just like, this is my voice, this is what I see, or this is the way I see the world?
I mean, I think there was a gap that I noticed. I think it came largely from my upbringing, being a third culture kid and living in a bunch of different places in a lot of international communities when I was younger. I really wanted to write about the intersection of like digital culture and globalization. I have mentors of mine who've written about, globalization really beautifully, but I felt like we were entering a new era in terms of the sort of rapid acceleration of globalization through the internet, and particularly as a sort of young Asian woman looking at how that was rubbing up against contemporary identity politics and sort of nascent Asian diasporic communities clashing for the first time. I just found all of that subject matter really interesting because it's my lived experience, and I felt like with White Pearl I had a chance to talk about something that particularly sort of like intra-Asian racism and anti-Black racism in the Asian community. At the time, nobody was really talking about it, and they certainly weren't writing plays about it.
Indeed. And so just explain to me, when you say third culture kid, what does that mean?
Third culture kid means you come from two backgrounds and you're raised somewhere else. So you've got, three cultures going on.
So Australian, Thai, and...
First in the Philippines. Yeah.
So coming to this latest work, The Poison of Polygamy, when did that first kind of hit your, when were you first aware of that, or how did that happen?
So I was the Patrick White Fellow at STC in 2019 and 2020, and part of that fellowship is it's accompanied by a play commission. So I was thinking about what I wanted to write for Sydney Theatre Company. And at that same time, as a sort of happy accident, as is the case with a lot of my career, I read an article about the recent publication of The Poison of the Polygamy, the first English translation, which is a kind of remarkable story of this first Chinese serialized novella that was written in a newspaper, a Chinese language newspaper in Chinatown called The Chinese Times. And I read it. I thought it was a sort of lost classic, a really important piece of our history. And so I just went to STC and said, hey, I found this thing and I'd really like to adapt it.
So did you take it in that kind of episodic kind of form when you've taken it to the stage or written it for the stage?
To an extent. I mean, I've tried to preserve the rollicking scope of it. It's such a sort of huge, sprawling adventure because of that episodic nature of it. But I also have, as you often do as a dramatist when you're adapting something from the page to the stage, you have to conflate things and you try and give it a little more sort of like narrative cohesion in order to fit in a very different form.
Yeah. It sounds like it's got a lot of, I want to say issues, things that it's talking about. Do you want to just kind of maybe set the scene? So does it start in China and come to Australia? So what's that scene?
So I've tried to stick pretty closely to the events of the novel, even though I think I've layered my own politics and jokes and lots of things into my adaptation. But the story of the novel is essentially a man who is, a lazy opium addict, a sort of ne'er-do-well, and his much, to the chagrin of his much aggrieved wife, decides that he's going to make his fortune on the gold fields. So he ends up setting sail from southern China and goes to the gold fields of Victoria, where he and his fellow migrants encounter a lot of different hardships that were being experienced by goldfielders. And from there, he sort of goes back and forth between the two countries. The reason it's called The Poison of Polygamy is that Wang Shiping was writing very much in line with his politics. He was a Christian preacher, he ended up being a political organizer, and he was decrying the evils of polygamy as it was practiced in China. So the novel is also supposed to be a kind of social parable decrying the practice of concubinage, or the taking of second and third wives in China. And in the second half of the novel, Sleepsick, the protagonist, meets his match with his concubine, who ends up being even sort of like fouler and more lascivious than he is, and kind of becomes the villain of the story. But I have a lot of sympathy for her in my adaptation.
It sounds like fun, a cheeky kind of, attitude towards that. But does that mean that it's kind of, and from reading I get this sense, there's this sort of moral questioning and can you talk to me about some of those kind of characters?
I mean, it is really framed like a parable, and in the tradition of classical Chinese literature, every now and then Wang Shiping will step outside of the narrative to tell you the moral of the story he's just told you.
Yeah.
So in my adaptation, I've sort of kept that device, but tried to problematize or add sort of doubt to the moral worldview that Wang Shiping has injected into his fable.
Because yes, it sounds like it's this historical novel. Obviously, there's so much of the history inside of that. Can you kind of set the scene? Like, this is 1910, and how much of the, I guess, original novel or that translation, I suppose, how does it talk to now? I mean, you've adapted it, obviously, like you say, with your own politics and that sort of thing. But how does it inform our understanding of Australia or today?
Yeah, I mean, Wang Shiping, because he was writing about the sort of nascent category that was Chinese Australians, I mean, the novel is very concerned with this key question of how do we, as citizens of these two societies, align our value systems that are seemingly incompatible. And he very much falls on the side of sort of Christian Western monogamy and lots of sort of Western progressivist ideals from the time is the way that we're going to drag China out of antiquity, and out of our sort of backwardsness. So it's almost a little self-reflexively racist as a novel. But it's fascinating because it captures this period of immense change and the sort of first mass contact between Chinese and European settlers and the complicity of Chinese settlers in colonization of this country. So I have then sort of spun out from that key question of how do we live as citizens of these two societies to speak to the historical context a little more deeply, and the sort of one of my key concerns in my adaptation is the legacy of mining on this continent and the long-lasting environmental effects of that period. And I talk in great detail about sort of where Chinese migrants fell in the racial pecking order at that time, and how they were both oppressed and the victims of systemic racism, but also ended up perpetrating racism and being complicit in colonization.
There's a lot in there to talk about. There's a lot in there kind of to fill into a play, and it's quite a long play, but and epically traverses, I guess, time. But historically for you, when you were kind of looking at this research, I have two questions actually. Wonder why it was published like that way in the newspaper, like what it was actually saying of the time. But then what was happening at that time, like you say about the progression of China and I guess it talks about Chinese diaspora and how and nationalism and colonization, like these big words. But what does I guess maybe let's start with the question, when it was written, why do you think it was published like that, like in this episodic in a newspaper? Who was it talking to?
So the Chinese Times was published for Chinese language readers in Australia. So it really was for this nascent diasporic community, the first Chinese settlers in Australia. And Wang Shiping, it's part of a literary tradition of classical Chinese novels to be written this way. But equally, it was in a sort of Dickensian way. It was a serialized novella designed almost like a soap opera to keep you coming back for weekly installments. And it was published over the course of the year. So it was their, binge-worthy Netflix series of the day, if you like, and speaking directly to this very new experience, which was only a generation old, of these Chinese migrants newly settling here. And it's propaganda, I would say. It's very much Wang Shiping trying to speak to his fellow countrymen and trying to convert them to saying, you should give up these old practices of the old country, like keeping women backwards in foot binding, and the fact that women couldn't read or write, the fact that we still take multiple wives, the fact that there's so much sort of proselytizing happening in the novel. So that was very much his readership.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So, and what fun. So are you, when you said like you're bringing your own politics or your own view to it, are you kind of filling in between the lines in a way? Yeah,
I think very much so. I was really interested in giving the audience the historical context that the book doesn't have, because it's written in his own period for his own audience. But I wanted the audience to understand just how much political organizing the Chinese migrants were doing at that time, how much violence they experienced from the European miners, how unfairly taxed they were, all of this sort of ancillary context that was the world that they were living in that the audience might not necessarily know. I've tried with my research to fill in some of those gaps.
So talk to me a little bit about how it's come to the stage from your script. It just sounds visually stunning. Can you kind of give me that scene? And you as a designer, I don't know that necessarily you thought about this in your writing, but How does it look?
So it's a really epic production. It's in the round. It's performed by this virtuosic ensemble of 8 actors who are all, playing multiple roles, and it's a very physical, almost like dance-like staging. Courtney Stewart, our director, has done just such a beautiful job of staging this work. It really does feel like sort of epic, almost Brechtian theater in the way that she's staged it. And all of our designers have done such beautiful work, particularly, James Liu's beautiful set design is these moving red columns that sort of morph and take on different meanings and structures. And Matt Shu's done this sort of wall-to-wall epic composition. Almost the entire show is scored, and he's taken a lot from like Chinese opera, traditional Chinese instruments. Yeah, so it's a really cohesive, beautiful production.
And does it sort of travel in time? Like, is it like in contemporary, or is it sort of can be any time?
It's very much rooted in the period, and we've tried to suggest the period without resorting to sort of historical cliches or chinoiserie. We've tried to. We talked a lot about a sort of frugality to the way that we depicted the late Qing dynasty. We wanted objects that like transform in meaning. So it's very much playing with the history without being sort of like rigidly historical.
Mm-hmm. It sounds just gorgeous, and as I said, it's getting 5-star reviews. I love how in the notes I think you describe yourself as a promiscuous adapter. Is that kind of a comment on polygamy as well as your take? Like, what do you think is the I guess what's the thing that drew you to you initially, right from the beginning in the story?
I mean, I think it's really interesting in terms of polygamy, and certainly it's like my dumb joke is very much about sort of this key question of the play being polygamy, that I think as a society we're now having the inverted conversation about monogamy versus polygamy, which I find really interesting. And I think that's what drew me to the book. I thought there's so much in here that actually speaks to how we live now. And we're still grappling with these questions, 300 years later, about what it means to exist as citizens of two societies and how we align our values. But also, having said it was 300 years ago, this is our grandparents' and great-grandparents' generation. Like, it wasn't that long ago. And, Wang Xiping's grandsons were at our opening night. I mean, it's in the immediate family histories for a lot of us. So it's also very much a play about our ancestors and what we would like our predecessors, 300 years from now, what we would like them to say about us, and how we occupied our time on this continent.
It sounds like, I mean, and is this what you mean? There's this inverted conversation of polygamy now. I'm not sure what that means. And then are you saying that we're kind of like in this polygamous sort of society where we can take a little bit of Buddhism, or a little bit of Christianity, or a little bit of, all of these, or culturally as well? Like, does it traverse that?
When I said inverted polygamy, I was talking about literal polygamy. Like, at the time of the novel, it was he was very much saying, like, stop taking multiple lovers and start just marrying the one person and commit to them. And I think as a society, we're now having the inverted discussion. So I think if Wang Xiping was around, which I've sort of, the narrator character in my play, the preacher, tries to talk directly to the contemporaries and go, no, you must stop this social evil, like, befouling your veins anew. So I find that really interesting, too, that these things come in historical cycles.
Yeah, okay. But do you think that we're also in this kind of polygamous sort of cultural, gender, politics, polygamy?
Yeah, I think, one of the dialectics, that's a wanky way of saying it, one of the themes of the play is very much about monoculture versus a sort of polyculture. And Wang Xiping was asserting this worldview that was very, you worship one god, you marry one partner, you have one set of cultural values. And that meant that he had a sort of inflexible moral worldview. And I think we have a far more flexible moral worldview, and that's very much the question that I'm trying to pose with my adaptation is about coexisting, actually, and how we can take in all these different new cultural inputs that we have as a society and find a way to exist harmoniously without exploitation.
Yeah. Multifaceted we are, and the play is indeed. Anchuli Felicia King, thank you so much for joining. It just looks incredible.
No worries. Thank you very much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Well, that was Anchuli Felicia King there talking about The Poison of Polygamy on at Sydney Theatre Company at the moment and running until the 8th of July. That's in the Wharf 1 Theatre at STC.